Hi there, everyone. It is 1 o'clock on Wednesday. We welcome you to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. This is Edgar Zazueta to my right, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. Again, welcome. Drop us a line on the chat, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. Tell us where you're watching from, what school district you're from. Say hello to us. Edgar back after a week. And the big question today, Edgar, as you celebrate the Dodgers' victory, I mentioned this in the promo this morning. How was the celebration in your house? Did you and your kids flip over cars in the street in front after it happened?
Hey, Naj. Well, first of all, I missed you guys last week. Thank you for holding down the fort without me. And I think the intro, I think it's a backhanded way of you congratulating me for the Dodger championship. So I'll take it from a Giants fan. And I'm going to rub it in just for a second. I'm going to throw on the hat.
Oh, geez, my goodness.
I'm just good. I'm going to milk it. Hey, we waited 32 years. Gotta do it up for a couple minutes here. I appreciate you asking me about the celebration. I mean, if it goes to show how much this has probably impacted my mental health, I think I had a dream a couple of nights ago that Vin Scully had called me about the World Series. So, take that for whatever it's worth. It was a good night. It was a good night for Dodger fans. I was 8 years old the last time the Dodgers won the World Series. Literally remember watching on a black and white 13-inch TV in my dad's garage. I'm not sure why my mom kicked us out to the garage. So it was great to experience it with the kids. And I know there's a lot of Giants fans and other folks here in California, but we're gonna enjoy it. We're gonna enjoy it here for a second.
I told my wife this morning that the Rams or Chargers better not win the Super Bowl this year, because you guys have had your fill for Los Angeles for it.
I don't know if I would have been able to. I may have had to miss a second show in a row today if we were prepping for a Game 7 tonight.
Yeah,
I don't know if my mental acuity would have been there or the stress level. So probably good for all of us that they took care of it last night.
I was going to say, Edgar and I were in a meeting yesterday afternoon, and at the close, we were wondering what Edgar's condition was going to be like at the start of this show. Would the red eyes be as he prepared for a Game 7? So, hey, Edgar, good to have you back. Say hello today. Gary, Angela, our loyal viewer, Michelle, Betsy McKinstry, of Dodger fans saying yay to the Dodgers. Lisa, Cheryl, good to have all of you guys with us today. Molly already congratulating your shirt, Edgar. I got to get off this Dodgers topic. It's going to drive me nuts as a Giants fan. Hey, again, thank you all of our viewers for joining us. Let us know where you're chiming in from today. We've got a lot of topics to cover. We're going to talk school reopening plans. We've got our federal insider to talk a little bit about federal funding for California schools. And we have one of our keynote speakers from Leadership Summit, which kicks off next week here with a bit of a preview. Edgar, let's talk school reopenings really quickly, because there's an article October 26th in the Bee about the school reopening plan from Elk Grove Unified. For those of you who may not remember, Elk Grove Unified, the largest district in this region, was the first district statewide to go out for COVID-19. This is what came out from them earlier this week, that if the county, Sacramento County, has a lower infection rate by November 3rd, moving from the red to the orange tier, then students from preschool to third grade would return to campuses November 17th in some form, fourth grade through sixth grade on December 8th, and then middle school and high school after January 1. If there isn't the move from red to orange on the governor's established tier with CDPH, then distance learning would continue. So, Edgar, this kind of not necessarily just for Elk Grove Unified, but this brings up several other topics related to COVID and with school reopening plans. One thing that I did like about Elk Grove's plan, and if Muhammad Warad, who's an assistant principal in Elk Grove Unified, and a loyal viewer may want to respond to this. I did like that Elk Grove Unified was very clear on what will move them to reopen schools. It provides some clarity. One thing that I am interested in, what the questions were like from people in the school community, whether it was teachers or students or parents. What kind of questions were they hearing about that? So Mohammed, chime in, and anybody else really. As far as where we are on COVID, I'm going to knock out these statistics very quickly. The governor said trending up modestly yesterday, up 5.9% increase in the new ICU admissions, 4.7% increase in hospitalizations. New York Times today reporting 500,000 new cases over the past week, and now new restrictions are being implemented. So, all right, Edgar, let's dissect this. First off, how important right now is clarity on these reopening plans? We're seeing it out of Elk Grove Unified, but from what you're seeing.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of interesting issues there, Naj. First off, the whole point, and I do think Elk Grove, given that their context there, they being one of the first that being the first who actually shut down back in March. And what's interesting is what we're seeing now in practice is something we've been talking about on the show for a number of weeks. It feels like ancient history now when we're trying to dissect this new blueprint for a safer economy and the whole color-coded system that sometimes it gets confusing on what is purple, what is red. What is red usually means stop, but in this case, red means we can open. But here's the bottom line on this point, that as we've been saying, getting off of purple from the state's perspective had essentially been the marker of now you're able to open up schools. From the public health perspective, they deemed, even though they're calling it still you have substantial COVID spread, that was supposed to be the marker of like, now we can move and open schools. What we're seeing in practice, and I think we're only down at per the governor's latest statistics and CDPH's statistics, I think we only have 9 counties in purple now. So only 9 counties who are not allowed to open schools. Now, what we've seen in practice is that even though a lot of these counties that are in red are eligible to open schools, it's not happening. And that's for a variety of reasons. And, there's some legislative conversations this week, some oversight hearings about, and we could talk about that in a second, in terms of them asking the question, what is going on in the field here? Why is this not happening? Our folks know it firsthand, whether it be testing, labor management, collaboration, or buy-in. Just because districts or counties are going to red does not mean that they're necessarily opening right away. And I think Elk Grove is the latest example. They've actually created a more stringent marker.
Yes, and thank you to all of our viewers who have joined us, Terry and Cheryl and Anna, Terry Sanders. Terry, I got a message for you about your Summit Survival Kit, so hopefully I can tackle that by the end. Edgar, you've been in informational meetings involving lawmakers, educators over at the state capitol this week. What's coming out of those informational hearings, and what's the response right now as far as school reopenings?
Yeah, this week was interesting because it was the legislature's first chance really to have their say about what's happening with school reopening. The reality is this whole year, the power has really shifted even more from the legislative branch to the executive, because so much of this, as we've talked about, is coming from public health, is coming from executive orders, coming from the governor's office. And the legislature, they have they could chime in, but they're not making these rules. So some of the themes that were coming out of these oversight hearings, if you will, were them pushing on the governor's office and on the California Department of Public Health about how some of the guidelines may not be consistent, that some of the guidelines specifically, there was a lot of frustration around testing, the guidelines specifically around COVID testing, that even though the state guidelines only talk about testing every other month and half of your staff population, what they're seeing in practice is that our employee groups, in many cases, are calling for much more stringent guidelines. And so there was a lot of frustration from the legislature to the executive branch about aren't we making it harder for school districts by putting the local control on them and saying, yes, you can open even with this, but knowing that the practical reality is that local communities are often asking for so much more. There was this repeated question about what else should the state be doing? And I think the issue number one was, should the state have a bigger role in making COVID testing accessible to our schools? And also, who pays for that?
Yeah, and you know what? We just got a comment from Cheryl Quinones, and she says, the information basically is confusing. So glad, I watch everything. We can't open in the border cities. I do think it's interesting that Cheryl would talk about the border cities, because in some parts of the state, we hear no issues. In fact, they've been open since the start of the school year, but then in others, that's not necessarily the case. So there is confusion out there and so many differences, no matter where you are in the state.
Naj, the one last point I'll make on this, and I think it's an important piece, is there's also a growing concern about the equity issues, about the districts that are able to open as opposed to the not. I think if you look at the statistics, whether it be through the waiver process or even our traditional public schools, that a much higher percentage of more affluent districts or LEAs, or in the case of private schools, they, by numbers, or smaller districts, they've been the ones that have by far been able to open. Whereas just from the number standpoint, some of the LEAs that have higher percentages of students in need are having more challenges. And that's also because of the inequities in the pandemic itself, right? That communities with higher numbers of minority students, lower socioeconomic communities are being impacted by COVID at a higher rate as well.
And so happy to thank you guys with us here, Patricia and Karen, Alyssa Lynch, a good friend of mine, Victor Uribe, Gail Olson, and Sean Webb. Gail Olson, Edgar, says she went to Epps Field. So that's like a true Dodgers fan.
That's hardcore right there. Yeah. Go back to our Brooklyn.
Hey, folks, let's talk some federal information right now. We've got our federal insider, our D.C. insider on with us now. The founding partner from Foresight Law and Policy, Reg Leichty, joins us from D.C. Reg, so good to have you. We're so used to having you with us on this side of the country at this time of year. So good to have you with us today.
Yeah, great to see you, Naj, and nice to spend a little bit of time with our friends on the West Coast.
Hey, let me ask you, there's something happening a little less than a week from now. Something that we don't talk about on this show, but we know is certainly going to happen. Give us an idea of what it's like in Washington, D.C. right now. What's the general feeling with everything going on, and maybe the anticipation ahead of Election Day?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty incredible moment, obviously. I would say, like in a lot of parts of the country, there's, a certain amount of exhaustion. All of the pandemic concerns kind of weighing on the Congress, but also just the pace of work leading up to an election of this consequence. So I think there's, even with the Congress out of town, a real kind of tension in the city right now about how the dust is going to settle after Tuesday, hopefully right after Tuesday and not well into November. But I think all sides are kind of ready for this election to happen so that, an assessment can be made about where we go next, not only in the lame duck session, but also kind of turning into 2021 and getting 2020 behind us. Except for the Dodger win. We'll give you that.
Nationals got it last year. They broke our hearts. Brought it back. Okay. Reg, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
So part of our budget here in California, and it's an issue I know you've helped us navigate, and we've been talking about it for months, is that as we're now looking to 2021, it's a stark reminder that the California state budget was built and avoided cuts on the premise that we were going to get federal relief from Congress, that we would have another round of stimulus. Obviously, that hasn't happened. Here now we're on the doorstep of the election. Maybe if you give us some prognosis on where you see things at on that front, and just from a more national perspective, is California unique in this respect, where they were really clinging on to hopes of having some support, and what that may mean? Obviously, depending on what happens next week, could change the variables. But what do you see on the horizon on that?
Yeah, I think California wasn't unique in the kind of budgeting process this year. I don't think we can underestimate just how unusual it was for Congress and the White House to fail to act on this national emergency in an environment where it seemed like every stakeholder had a massive incentive to provide some additional assistance to not only our schools, but also, other parts of the economy, including our state and local governments. I think, it's worth a little bit of kind of thought into why that happened. I think the first was this sort of miscalculation by the Senate Majority Leader and kind of bringing up, or at least waiting to bring up a bill until the end of July, and then finding that a large number of his caucus in the Senate was actually opposed to additional spending above, $500 billion, which was I think, the biggest impediment to getting a deal done over the last few weeks. But even looking more recently than that, the White House's unilateral withdrawal from the negotiations just a few weeks ago, even with the president's numbers lagging nationally, was, of course, a huge surprise to the kind of Democratic members of the House and Senate. And I think, this issue of just how much funding should be provided to state and local government to help them weather the economic crisis that's associated with the pandemic is one of the most hard-fought issues, with Democrats calling for substantially more funding for state and local government than the majority party in the Senate was willing to do. So, I will be personally surprised if any deal is kind of in the works before 2021. I desperately hope that I'm wrong, but I think all signs point to kind of a lame duck period that is very difficult to come to consensus on any issue, let alone something as consequential as a $2 to $3 trillion emergency spending bill.
Hey, Reg, quick follow-up before I hand it back to Naj on this whole issue of a lame duck session. So you don't see that being a productive period, regardless of who wins next week, or regardless if there's a change or what?
I'll say the obvious. I mean, obviously Tuesday is going to be the kind of deciding factor in just what the context is during the lame duck session. But my feeling is that should the polls take us, should the election take us where the polls are pointing, with a switch in the White House and more than likely a switch in the Senate control as well, I think that mix in particular leads to a kind of standoff period between now and the holidays. And it's also, just to say, as a reminder, the House and Senate aren't scheduled to come back, at least at the same time, for until 2 weeks after the election. They then got to deal with the normal budget process before the continuing resolution expires on December 11th. And then you're into kind of the end of year holidays. So I think you've got both a political problem where incentives are not going to be there to move the bill. And then I think you've got this short calendar as well. The one exception to that might be, if Vice President Biden wins the election and the Republicans maintain control of the Senate. I think if that happens, I think you might have a formula where an agreement is reached before the holidays. But at this point, it doesn't look like that's the way the wind is blowing.
Reg, let me ask you, I pulled some numbers from Education Week this week around funding and what Joe Biden is proposing. These are the numbers. He wants to increase Title I funding by nearly $50 billion and fully fund the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, within 10 years, which would mean the federal government would be paying 40% of the additional costs linked to special ed services. He's also pledged to address a $23 billion funding gap between predominantly white and predominantly non-white districts. You've heard many pledges over your many years over there in D.C. From your lens, just these, numbers that are out there, how much of this is actually possible?
Yeah, I think that those are pretty lofty numbers, of course. We, should not be, as I said, surprised if there isn't a very large infusion of funding into K-12 education, into early learning, into higher education as a result of the next emergency spending bill. But I think some of these longer term commitments, a 40 to $50 billion increase in Title I, that of course wouldn't be for 1 year, but would be an ongoing expense. I think that's probably more ambitious than, a White House might be able to achieve. Again, the election will have a huge impact on that. Should the Democrats have a very large working majority, they might have more success in expanding the education budget because, of course, even if they take control of the body, they'll need 60 votes to pass spending bills and a lot of other policy measures unless they decide to do away with the filibuster, which will be a big question for the next Congress. But, that doesn't mean that, we shouldn't expect this White House to be substantially more engaged on education policy, that they shouldn't be pushing much harder to increase education spending, both, Title I, I think the IDEA formula for Part B and C are both things that could see some substantial increases. But, will they receive $40 billion each? I think that's unlikely. So let's say that we're headed the right direction, but probably not towards a $100 billion annual increase in the education budget at the federal level.
Reg, we got a question from one of our loyal viewers, and she always seems to ask good questions. Angela asked, are there conversations about caveats coming with funding? For instance, do states, counties, municipalities have to prove that they're doing something to prevent COVID transmission? Obviously, we're talking theoretical because there's not a deal in place, but maybe if you could give us a flavor of what those conversations have been around if there's going to be more funding dedicated to COVID relief. What parameters are they putting on?
Yeah, Angela, that's a really interesting question. So what we saw from the Republican plan in July and what we heard the White House talk a lot about was a contingency for those funds tied to reopening the physical classrooms. So the president, I think, in looking at his reelection, his advisors said, we really have to have kids back in school. So they said, we're going to make a big portion of these emergency funds contingent upon open classrooms. There were other steps that were a little less noticed by the media, a refusal for many weeks on end to extend some of the nutrition waivers that have allowed those programs to work more effectively during the pandemic. Some walking back from some of the distance learning investments that, would be needed to better serve for kids at home. And I think all of those were designed to push kids back to the classroom. My view now is that with school started and with the election ending on Tuesday, that those contingencies on physical reopenings are actually going to fall by the wayside for the White House. So the president's no longer really going to have, I think, that incentive to really push schools to reopen before they may be ready based on the pandemic conditions in their community. As for your question specifically, Angela, whether or not there would be a condition, a requirement by a district or a state to show that they're trying to address COVID, I think that's less likely. I think what we would be more likely to expect to see was, sort of a commitment for the receipt of funding to be, working towards the, resolving the problem, to making sure the classrooms are safe for kids and teachers and staff. But this idea, I think, that you might have to come back and prove, through some sort of indicate some sort of measure is likely.
Reg, I'm going to test the depth of your knowledge on HR legislation here because Shelton Yip, one of our ACSA board members, asks a question. Quote, inquiring minds want to know, is HR 141 still in play? I would ask Reg to answer that question, fully understanding you have a deep knowledge of every HR that's going on in DC right now.
Yeah, well, I'm going to cheat and use Google. I see that that's about the Social Security Fairness Act. You shouldn't let me do these kind of interviews from the comfort of my desk. I think that's probably a bill that will be, reintroduced again in the 117th Congress. So, with the election coming up, we're coming to the end of this 2-year kind of period. So every piece of legislation will have to be reintroduced next year. That's been a long fought battle, and I think one that we'll continue to see members beating the drum on. I don't know specifically how much traction that will have next year, but again, in this environment where, frankly, the country's going through some pretty significant change, I think we could expect, and in a really difficult budget environment, some legislation dealing with entitlement programs, including the Social Security system, that might provide an opportunity, to attach that bill to the wagon.
Reg, our viewers continue to, I think they just want to be impressed by your knowledge here, but I know this is one that you have some understanding on. Holly, one of our also loyal members and part of our ACSA leadership, asked, what is the latest information on liability protection, limited liability protection, something we've been talking a lot about at the state level. What if anything is happening back east?
Yeah, so I think one of the positive aspects of the Republican bill that I mentioned that was introduced in July on the Senate side was inclusive of some protections from lawsuits, except in the most kind of egregious instances. For example, if there was gross negligence. There has not been a lot of progress on building bipartisan support for that bill, which was covering not only school districts, but also other employers. I think many on the Democratic side have stood up to oppose liability protections for employers. I don't think, we should give up the fight on that issue yet. I think kind of the experience this fall will certainly provide more kind of information to the Congress about just why that's important. So I would, say to all the listeners today, if you have, specific instances arising in your communities that, relate to that issue, share it with the ACSA team so that we can make sure that the California delegation has that at their fingertips early next year.
Reg, I'm going to do a dangerous thing, and I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions on who's going to win the election. But we'll stay away from that. But, when we're having these conversations, we always, especially here in California, we're selfish. We want to know, how's this going to impact us, right? And without getting ahead of ourselves, if there was to be a change in leadership, the president and the administration, how do you think that's going to impact California, given that, we have Kamala Harris as part of the ticket, Californian. We always hear rumblings about shakeup and secretaries of education, or we know anytime there is a change in a presidential administration, especially if it goes from one party to another, that feels like your city there has an exodus and a new city comes in. Just generally speaking, what, if anything, should Californians be on the lookout if there's changes there on the federal end?
Yeah, it's a great question, Edgar. And I think what everyone should know is that should Vice President Biden be elected, immediately following the election, there will be a formal transition team that will begin work to stand up the new government. And that team will include a committee of education leaders who are specifically tasked with identifying the early priorities of the new administration, but also identifying, and you kind of alluded to this, the leadership team for the education department. So, I think what we already know is that loose kind of affiliation of those people have been working and meeting virtually every couple of weeks for the campaign. We know that at least 3 of the kind of rumored potential secretaries of education are part of that process. I think we know that some of those people are California folks, which is great. And I think we can expect that if not the secretary, that there are folks at the assistant secretary, the deputy assistant secretary level in the agency that are going to have some real strong perspectives about the major issues facing the state. That's not just the core education policy issues. What do we do with assessment and accountability this spring if students continue to be displaced? How do we solve some of these home broadband connectivity issues, but also things like how do we help students through this kind of period of environmental emergencies that are impacting the state? How do we deal with issues like lead and water that affect other agencies? Because it's not just about the Department of Ed, but also the leadership of the Federal Communications Commission, the leadership of the, housing and urban development, all of the pieces of the puzzle that support kids and their families in the learning process. So look out for that transition team to be kind of more formally announced should the vice president win. And then all of that work will lead up to the nomination of a secretary early next year, who of course would have to be confirmed by the Senate. But at that point, I think we'll have a much clearer picture of just what the administration will focus on in 2021 in education. Certainly part of that's going to be pandemic emergency response first and foremost, and then some of the policy that is, follows immediately behind that.
Hey, Reg, before we let you go, we know that you're the boss over there at Foresight Law and Policy. I just want to know, actually all of our viewers know, as our DC advocate, our federal advocacy arm, as the boss, how stringent are you about shorts during office visits? Like, are you okay with your staff wearing shorts while they're there, or do you have other rules in place?
Yeah, just to put a fine point on this, my business partner is in Wyoming, and she told me it was 10 below 2 days ago. So, shorts, parkas, whatever it takes to be comfortable. That's where we are.
Reg Leichty, founding partner, Foresight Law and Policy, our federal advocacy arm. Reg, so good to have you on the show today. We'll bring you on again, and you can tell us if all of your predictions were correct.
Great to talk with both of you. Look forward to catching up after the election.
Sounds good. Thanks, Reg.
Thanks, guys.
Folks, want to let you know that next week is ACSA's all virtual 2020 Leadership Summit. We have a fantastic event coming up for you next week. We did have one of our keynote speakers yesterday send a message to all participants and all ACSA members, our viewers, about her appearance. So let's go ahead and show that to you.
Hello, ACSA family. I am Elizabeth Smart, and I will be speaking on November 5th at 3 o'clock. I know that what each of you do truly makes a difference, and so I want to thank you, and I really hope that you will join and listen to me and join in the Q&A afterwards. See you soon.
That is right. Elizabeth Smart is going to be one of the keynote speakers for that event. If you don't know about her story, go ahead and hit the Wikipedia, of course, after the show is done, and go ahead and find out. All access to all of the workshops begins Monday and extends through November 10th. So you don't have to be there on that day or just see one workshop or just a couple. You have access to more than 50 workshops beginning Monday all the way through November 10th. We'll have live coverage of the event November 5th and November 6th. That live coverage will include our keynotes, Q&A with our keynotes, including your opportunity to talk with Elizabeth Smart and our two other keynote addresses, live and interactive opportunities, table talks, panel discussions. Thursday night, we end with the Every Student Succeeding Awards ceremony. Friday, we end with the AOI. And for those of you who register, and remember the registration is ACSA.org/leadership summit. Edgar and I are going to do the happy hour edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break at 4:15 on Thursday. Only those of you who are registered for the event get to see it. But Edgar, you and I during happy hour is one thing, but now we have the opportunity to bring on a bunch of mystery guests, and it's live TV. So mystery guests means there's all kinds of excitement that can happen.
We're going to have plenty to talk about next week. Now that our sports seasons are over, my other, passion here being a political junkie. So like a couple of days after the election, I think it's going to be jam-packed, and we're going to have a lot of analysis to make coming a couple of days off of big elections.
I can't believe you just said your sports season is done. USC football kicks off in like a week, right?
Yeah, give me a couple of days. My heart, my nerves need a little bit of a break here. So give me some time, and I'll transition there.
Well, I'll tell you folks, as a current Penn State student, I refuse to talk about that garbage call at the end of their game against Indiana this week because it was just garbage. Hey, Terry Sanders, you asked a question last week, and I want to make sure that I update you on this and update all of our viewers. Terry asked about her Summit Survival Kit last week, and where was it? Terry, it's coming out. So if you haven't gotten it yet, you certainly will be. All of the first 500 registrants get one of those survival kits. So make sure that you register for that, ACSA.org/leadership summit. Edgar has already got our guests lined up for next week. That's Kevin Gordon. Edgar, as we have crossed the bottom of the hour here, I'm going to expect that Kevin is going to have a lot of information, not just on the federal side, but obviously Proposition 15, which we've talked about here, the impact on public schools. He's going to have some good assessment of.
Yeah, Kevin never has a shortage of words or perspectives. So I imagine just hours after the election, and, you know, given our new reality, just because it's post-election day, we may still be in the midst of trying to figure out who won some key races. So it'll be interesting. I'll look forward to those conversations.
Absolutely. Well, folks, thanks so much for being with us today. Happy to have all of you with us throughout today's show. Those of you who threw in questions as well. Don't forget, registration for ACSA Leadership Summit, ACSA.org/Leadership Summit. We got a big show for you next week, so you definitely want to be here 1 o'clock on Wednesday, live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Edgar, we'll see you next week.
Good seeing you, Naj.
Take care, everybody. Have a great day.